lives. So, thank you for coming out again, Nick. I
No
appreciate
problem.
it. And I know that you're pretty busy with everything that you've got going on with school and your own personal practice and, all that fun stuff, and then trying to also enjoy life. Um, how's your summer been shaping up?
All things considering, trying to make the most of it, trying to keep some sort of routine for my own sanity as well as my wife's sanity. I think it's helpful that, we're trying to keep a nice like work life flow and balance happening. Um, but no, I mean, I definitely feel fortunate that for me, a lot of things have been uninterrupted despite what's going on in the world. So, especially from a professional standpoint, I feel pretty blessed.
That that's awesome. Now, you two are you both working from home right now?
So she is a program manager for an IT company in the city, and she was probably working predominantly remote like for maybe a year now. So the transition to fully remote hasn't been so hard. I mean, I think she misses some of the interacting with her coworkers in an office setting. For me, it started mostly remote, but I would say as early as like mid-April with the proper face wear and whatnot, the masks, I was seeing people in my office because there's just certain situations with clients where it's not always conducive to talk like over, a Zoom meeting or, like there's just certain things, or maybe they don't have privacy in their home to even do that. So my office was kind of like a safe haven for many clients to still come in even during it.
So you were even through this whole thing, you've been seeing clients in person, even just having face masks and all that stuff. Um, so when you are both working from home, how do you guys manage the time so that you're not overlapping? I feel like for a lot of people right now, everybody's kind of working from home as long as they're working. Um, and a big thing that a lot of people run into is either, you know, having a space dedicated for work and maintaining that routine. How have you guys managed to keep a routine and to kind of keep out of each other's hair, so to speak, so that you can both get what you need done and not kind of interfere?
So it's interesting because I guess my schedule has been very hard to have a routine. Just by virtue of it being in mental health and having, my really my work schedule kind of reflects those that I work with. So sometimes it could be mornings, afternoons, evenings, weekends even. And I've probably been working, up to 7 days a week at times, by appointments for like the last 4 or 5 years. So my schedule hasn't been very routine. And then, with school commitments and other sort of jobs I've had. And I have to say, even my wife, while she does work, I guess you could say the more typical 9 to 5, she's always had a second job. For her, I mean, it's interesting. I almost think like when she has free time, not even necessarily for the financial piece, but she just likes to be active and busy in some regard. So we both like, I guess we kind of maybe coordinate on a Sunday, just kind of check in with each other what the schedule is going to look like. But for the most part, we do respect each other's like kind of space and privacy, and we've been together for so long, so she's pretty much aware of what I'm doing. I'm aware of what she's doing. So I mean, it's been pretty seamless, honestly. I mean, she has her like obviously like kind of physical space for her work from home setup. I'm a little bit more all over the place. It could be in the kitchen, could be in the living room, but again, we're making it work.
So when you guys are coordinating, um, do you have any recommendations to help people kind of make that coordination a little bit more seamless? Like, for example, do you recommend that everybody, uh, in your experience at least, has their own physical space, or kind of almost commingle like their own home office together? Do you have you found that uh, one is better than the other at all?
Well, I think just from a productivity standpoint, and it's kind of been studied, like in many respects, like especially for a home office, you kind of want to designate a certain space in your home to an activity. Like for instance, like the living room should be a place for relaxation if you so choose. So, your kind of brain attributes relaxation with or associates relaxation with that space. So it kind of promotes relaxation. Now the kitchen could be a place for eating, or maybe that's where you bring your family together. So really designating a place in your home primarily for like a work function kind of again creates those associations like in our brain in a way. So it almost can enhance productivity. Sometimes where you get into trouble is if, like, okay, your kitchen, for instance, or like your dining room setup is, where you eat, it's where you work, it's where your computer is for when you play video games. Like, all of a sudden it's serving many functions. So it might be kind of harder to focus in on one single thing without other things kind of bleeding into it. But I would say if you're living with somebody, so much of pretty much whether it's couples counseling, family counseling, communication is just the thing. It is all about how can we improve communication. And if you communicate with your partner, I think you both can kind of arrive at certain compromises or understandings to make it the most effective for two people.
So, what's the best way to communicate something like that? Like, how do you initiate that kind of conversation? I think a lot of people that I know um, rely on the intuition, for lack of a better word, of their partner to be able to kind of just know what's going on, or assume that, okay, well, this is going on, so they'll just understand. How do you initiate a conversation like that effectively, um, to be able to get across the point, like, hey, I need to make sure that this space is uh, noise free, or I'm going to be occupied at these times, or so on and so forth. How do you do that effectively?
Well, to start, like, what wouldn't be effective, I suppose, is I think a lot of times we might suppress certain feelings in the moment and not be direct in a way, in which case it could kind of culminate into like resentments and, like, frustration that kind of mounts and mounts and mounts until, you get the proverbial explosion.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think making that commitment to kind of be direct and just mutually respectful. It seems easier said than done, but I think many people avoid sometimes the direct conversation or communication.
Can you kind of define what you mean by direct? Because I think a lot of people associate with being direct almost with being mean
Yeah, I
or
was gonna actually
abrasive.
say confrontational. That's a common one. When
Yeah,
I explain being direct, everyone seems like, but I'm not confrontational. So, like, communication exists on a spectrum, right? Like, you got on one extreme side maybe the more passive approach where you bit more or less kind of like sacrifice your own needs and desires, and you're always kind of like trying to appease others. And then you have the more aggressive side of communication where that's more like it's dominating, controlling. It's my way or no way. And then in the middle is, again, spectrum, but in the middle is something called assertiveness. And assertive is like the wave where the attempt is to both be mutually respectful, expressing your needs in an open, direct, kind manner, while also trying to be, like, understanding. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to just give in because you want to appease someone else. And it doesn't mean you're going to try to dominate someone else. But so being direct, I think, is more like being authentic in how you're feeling and expressing that in a respectful way.
mm-hmm.
But I think the authentic piece is key, because it's like if you're feeling something and you're not saying it, there tends to be kind of an internal clash at times, and it will show up in different places if over time. It's just not sustainable. So,
Sure.
like, if you eat your words, so to speak, again and again and again, it's going to show up, whether symptoms for you or maybe your anger or elsewhere. It's just going to show up. So I do think authentically, if you can feel something and express it, and how you express it, if when I say direct, I mean direct, but also in a kind and respectful manner. I just think it could lead to better outcomes, or at the very least, it can get the whole compromise and negotiation process started.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, when you have people that say, "Oh, but I'm not confrontational," or they have that apprehension towards it, um, what are some of the ways that you help them to work through and be a little bit more assertive and understand that it's not about being confrontational, but it's more about making sure that you are authentic to yourself and able to communicate effectively so that you're not sacrificing yourself, but you're also not uh, coming across as confrontational or being confrontational.
And it could be difficult, yeah, because people that associate being direct with being confrontational, in many respects, it's that maybe they've learned over time to be passive. Maybe in some ways, whether it's through their family growing up or elsewhere, that they had to suppress their voice or sacrifice their own needs for others. So there is such a huge, I guess you could say, subconscious emotional feeling that's associated with all this. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
it starts with, like, kind of self-awareness, because you could teach anyone behaviors. Like, I could teach someone what assertiveness communication looks like. We could role play in an office setting. But if there's still these, like, emotional snags for the person, they're going to often feel something in the home setting or wherever they're feeling it, and they're kind of gonna, I don't want to say regress, but you're gonna behave in what's familiar, what's comfortable. Now it might not be effective and it might not be the most functional way, but we often do behave in ways that we're familiar and comfortable with, which usually is a byproduct of repetition and things that we used to do since childhood, really.
So how do you overcome that?
Um, well, for people, for everyone, it could be different, but I would say the therapist and patient or client relationship offers in many ways a way of kind of socially experimenting with different methods and behaviors and really trying to create like an in vivo learning corrective emotional experience for the person. So because even with a therapist, if someone is having, let's say, issues communicating directly or assertively, that client will still feel something even doing it in a therapist's office, because many of these behaviors that we have, these feelings, we generalize them in all different ways. Like if I'm shy in many, or if I feel like passive in this regard, and with my marriage, I might be passive with my friends, maybe I'm even passive at school with my coworkers. So in a way, you kind of have to like generate almost like an experience through the therapist client relationship. So a lot of ways I will do a lot of like kind of role plays and just practicing, and then maybe freezing moments, and then trying to like explore what the client is thinking, because a lot of it is you have to have self-awareness,
Mm.
because our emotional impulses are so quick and instantaneous at times that we sometimes, again, how many times you hear it, think before you act, but often we act without thinking, because that's just, again, that's the power of the
Yeah.
emotional impulse.
Yeah, I've noticed that over time, as like in my own personal experience, I used to be a very, very shy. I still consider myself, well, I consider myself to be introverted. My therapist considers me to be extroverted, and we have different definitions of why. But I remember over time, going from not wanting to really interact with anybody, um, like in a work capacity, to being in a sales role where over time, like just like you said, building up the repetitions and getting comfortable in new situations, and how you have to be, and learning to just express what I feel, and what I you know need for a prospective client to understand. um, I think for me personally, what ended up making a huge difference was, uh, like you said, doing the role playing, number one. And then it was almost like I created a scenario in my mind where it was like, in their best, like, I almost made it where if I don't do this, I'm now hurting them by not making sure that this is coming across the way that it needs to, because uh, I would be doing them a disservice. And then, uh, as it went along, I became more and more comfortable with it. And I noticed that, maybe you've seen this too, but I've noticed that my kind of comfort level and almost my happiness kind of went up, because it sort of spilled over into other areas of my life,
Mm-hmm.
where now I'm able to not feel so um, guilty about expressing certain things. And it kind of leveled a lot of things out. Um, And then I actually want your opinion on this too. So I mentioned that I consider myself to be a bit of an introvert. My therapist uh, considers me to be an extrovert, and the reason um, that I consider myself to be an introvert is because, generally speaking, I tend to be more of an observer in like a public setting, um, and kind of just take in the situation and observe it, and almost kind of on the sidelines, and that's where I enjoy being. And she considers me to be an extrovert, because through this whole process with COVID and being isolated and things like that, I kind of realized that I really like to be around other people, even though I'm, kind of just a passive observer in a lot of situations, unless I'm, with close friends. Like, how do you feel about how introversion versus extroversion, and all of those things kind of play into a person's ability to assert themselves effectively?
Yeah, so just like kind of the way you were thinking about extroversion and introversion had a piece of like communicating with others, like being sociable, I suppose. And while yeah, like I think a snap judgment, you hear introvert, you think more shy and reserved. You hear extrovert, you think more like outgoing and like personable.
Hmm.
But a lot of it also is like kind of where you draw like a sense of like kind of like energy. So I live very close to a train station.
I can hear that.
You might feel like it's right, literally in my backyard.
Do they
But
ever wake you up in the middle of the night?
no, you know what? It's kind of maybe at this point somewhat soothing, as long as the windows are down and nothing is shaking on the walls. So we don't have to worry about that. But like extroversion and introversion has a lot to do also with just like a level of comfort and kind of like where we derive our energy from. Like some people truly don't have to talk. Like they could be at like a Starbucks doing their work around people and feel content and good and fulfilled that way. So that could be more without even communicating. So
Hmm.
I think like also extroversion doesn't have to just purely be about communicating and meeting new people. I mean, that is a huge part of it, but I think also like deriving where you kind of derive like satisfaction and energy. And I would say like even with that, like nothing is dichotomous. Like people I think that are extroverts have introvert tendencies and vice versa, you know?
Hmm.
Um, so I really do think though, like one could be an introvert, let's say, or even more like in terms of like maybe not, more of like an observer in social situations and maybe less with like the actual verbal communication piece. But I would also say, like, at work or in other areas of your life, like, I almost reject the fact that like certain characteristics have to define us in such a generalizable way. Like, if I'm this, then I'm this across the board. When largely, I think the capacity for us as humans, like, we adapt and we adjust, and really based on the environment, based on our surroundings. So I don't know if there's really a direct answer in any of that. I would say though there are some genetic factors to anyone's personality, and introversion and extroversion do kind of have like a nature sort of genetic component. But by and large, again, like if you practice like anything, social skills are called skills. You know, like if you practice, you're gonna feel more confident, and if you feel more confident, you might be more comfortable doing things.
Yeah. How much of a factor do you think genetics play into not only someone's personality but their comfort in different scenarios?
I guess like they do it does play um, a, a big role. But I would also say what I am more interested in is someone's perceptions of their own genetic makeup. Because I guess, like, if somebody believes that because of like things outside of their control, this is just the way I'm born, this is just the way it's my brain, I can't do anything about it. That interests me versus someone who might, maybe genetically they have a certain personality makeup, but they feel very confident or comfortable with the idea of like, no, I could like, overcome this with practice. Like, so I guess it's more how people think about it, how people's perceptions are, because I
Hmm.
think that kind of says more than just saying like, well, genetically this is kind of like your breakdown of traits. So good luck, have a good life, because that seems very like fixed. I think
Yeah.
like in general, things are variable and changeable. I mean,
So
they
do
do
you
like
think it?
twin studies. I'm sorry to interrupt, but they've done
No.
twin studies for like years where, identical twins raised in different households. So like clearly there's a genetic overlap. But personality, huge differences and life trajectories and their outcomes in later in life. So like I mean, they've done science to show like it doesn't so much matter. Like genetics play a role, but nurture and the environment could be much more important.
So do you think that the environment and nurture versus nature has a bigger impact on the way someone perceives the world, or someone, uh, the trajectory of their life path takes? Do you feel like it's less genetics and more environment that affects that?
See, I'm gonna give like yeah, it's hard to. I would just have to say it's both because it's the environment within again like your kind of biological framework. Because I mean, there are things just like in terms of human development, like what's considered normative human development, with perception and our senses. Like I mean, that's just our biology. Those are our genetics. Like language acquisition. Like they're just certain things that no amount of the environment of teaching someone will change because our brains develop kind of along a you know typically speaking, during like according to kind of like a normal sort of trajectory. So like there is so much variability in the environment, but we're also kind of beholden to being humans and what our brains do developmentally speaking, which is just out of our hands. Like that's just it.
Sure. So, like, with something like that, how do people determine what aspect of their development, like how can you sit down when you sit down with someone and you say, okay, um, this person has been one way and you're trying to help them to change to more change to something different, just generic. um, how are you able to determine what was genetic, what was um, environment, or can you, and you just work with the way that they are and helping them to move towards what they're looking for and develop that way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like just in terms of any sort of like work that I do, that assessing an assessment is like a big part of it, and through the assessment, there's a lot of environmental factors I look at, as well as like, some things that might be more genetic based on like medical history and just like
Mm-hmm.
developmental milestones and you know things like that. But by and large, it is kind of like when someone meets me in their office, I'm interested in very much like upbringing.
Right.
I'm very much interested in their present relationships with all sorts of people.
Mm-hmm.
Their relationship, because so much of that, like the relationship piece, does kind of, because we are social creatures, like as human beings. So much of that kind of informs our feelings, our thought processes. So I would say, just in general, like, and also in terms of changing, especially seeking a therapist, there's just a lot more possibility when talking about environmental contributions. Because I don't know, it's almost like, again, it goes back to like, it's not my brain's fault. Like I'm doomed to be depressed because I'm having like a serotonin imbalance, like, which is important. You have to address that, and psychiatrists do with medication. But I think for like psychologists and other mental health like kind of talk therapists like that, we try to think of more different variables that you can manipulate, and usually it is environmental.
What are your thoughts? You mentioned like the with depression and a serotonin imbalance. I've heard a lot of mixed feelings about treating that with medication. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of that, and if it's where, which path do you feel is usually better for someone, whether it be uh, talk therapy or some type of non uh, substance therapy, or
Mm.
versus something like an antidepressant or something like that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, and they've also looked into this too, and they found like in conjunction with one another, I mean, it could be most effective, especially like for major depression,
Mm-hmm.
because I would say depending on the depression diagnosis, if it's like severe, moderate, mild, you might need just a certain level of medication just to really, again, it kind of shrinks. I don't want to say it shrinks, but it kind of might reduce exactly like just how low potentially you can go. So instead of like
Mm-hmm.
feeling this low, maybe it can help you. Like it just helps kind of give maybe that momentum.
Yeah.
But if you were to give someone medication that's like majorly depressed, for instance, like while they might feel somewhat better, there's so many other things about their behavior that might contribute to the depression, that without a sense of self-awareness, or like without a degree of maybe changing certain behaviors, no medication is a magic elixir. Like it's not going to let you stop feeling things or experiencing things in your life. So like, yeah, maybe you'll feel less down, but in an absolute sense, but there's still going to be depression unless other things are changed.
Right. So, like, for example, the medication that I have the most experience with would be something like an anti-anxiety, where the way that it was explained to me was that it's as you feel, it's designed or the proper way to use it would be as something where if you feel yourself going to a 10, it's designed to kind of slow that climb to give you time to kind of get a handle on it, almost like with modern cars that have the like emergency braking feature. It's not designed for you to only rely on that, but it's designed so that it gives you that little bit of extra to kind of reel it in yourself and kind of deal with things and process them in your own time, but it's not driving the car essentially.
Right. Well, I guess I like what sort of anti-anxiety would you be talking? Because like I mean, like a benzodiazepine, like Xanax, Klonopin, like Valium, like I mean, those are ones that are fast acting, and you're absolutely right. Like I mean, if you feel like an onset of a potential panic attack happening, like those medications could exactly do that, like maybe slow down things in a way where maybe you can respond more like logically, rationally, or in like kind of calm yourself down in many respects. Like those are very effective for that. Other kind of anti-anxieties are like, I mean, there are certain medications like the Lexapros, Prozacs that are like those aren't, you would take them every day and you probably won't notice much. You have to, it's recommended like after 8 weeks you might experience some
Hmm.
improvement, but it takes about 8 weeks before it like it can be effective.
Does it have to
So
like build up in your system in order
yeah,
for it to be effective?
yeah, more or less, right. Like it's
Okay.
kind of enhancing the production of that. So like it does take some time. But those are more like for if you have like kind of a general anxiety that's just, like a low grade, or I should say low grade, but you just have like a general anxiety that's just been there for a while. You notice it in many different areas. So they might prescribe that. But if like your anxiety, let's say if you have like a fear of, I don't know, flying, and you have a job where you have to fly places, then they probably would prescribe an anti-anxiety that's a little faster acting because you kind of know what the stressor is,
Hmm.
and taking that could absolutely reduce like some of those anxiety highs that you would be experiencing.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Do you feel like routines play a big role in people's anxiety, happiness, and things like that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we are what we consistently do. So, you know, we can be self-destructive with based on that, based on our routines, or we can be productive and enhance things as far as like our moods and whatnot. So yeah, I firmly believe our routine says a lot about us.
How do you? Because you'd mentioned now with your job, it's tough to have a pretty set routine. How do you kind of mitigate? How do you navigate that type of situation where you need to, for someone who wants to have a consistent routine, to have something to kind of almost treat as familiarity? Um, do you have any tips or recommendations on things to do to kind of either develop a positive routine for yourself or to work through a situation where you can't necessarily have a routine and still kind of get the positive effects as if you did?
Mm. I still think planning is just important, whether or not your routine is consistent, inconsistent. Like, even for me, like, I mean, my week to week, day to day could look very different from one another. Because
Mm-hmm.
again, hours are not the same. I do not like Monday through Sunday does not look the same from an hour standpoint week to week. But there is a planning. Like, I know what to expect at least the day before. Um, and I do think like, organization in that way I think it's foundational for some sense of routine, because I mean, there's a lot of just like randomness, and our thoughts can take us in all sorts of places if you just don't have a plan in place. I'm not making it seem. I mean, I enjoy spontaneous activity just as much as anyone, but I do think like consistently, if everything was just spontaneous and like let's live in the moment, and like that sounds good. Like treat every day like it's your last. That's good, but that's not what we're meant to do. Like we need some sense of stability, routine, and familiarity from just
Mm-hmm.
again like just a human growth standpoint.
So just having some sort of plan, even if it's not necessarily a consistent routine, but what you're suggesting is the day before or a couple days before, sitting down and saying, okay, this is what I have coming up, and having a plan so that it almost kind of fits that routine feel.
Mm-hmm. And I
Okay.
also think like planning, and not don't overdo it, but I think, I mean, we so not just work related tasks. Like I think plan for yourself, self care things, and other, maybe a social lunch with a friend, or maybe you're gonna call your parents this time, or maybe you're gonna go get a manicure or pedicure at this time. Like I do think that you got to put those in your schedule too, because a lot of times we tend to be imbalanced in this country in particular when it comes to our work and life.
Yeah, for sure. I myself am guilty of that, where I'll just kind of, there have been times where I'll wake up at 5 a.m. and then I've in the past gotten home at 8, 9 o'clock at night. You go home, go to sleep, wake up, rinse, repeat for a month straight, and then all of a sudden I find myself burned out, and I'm like, what have I done to myself? And then
Mm-hmm.
I look back and I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right. I haven't done anything for myself. I've just done work for the past however many weeks or days or what have you. Um, how do you think that affects you long term? Like, do you think it has any permanent? Uh, so many of us are feeling burnt out. Do you think that has any kind of permanent effect on anybody or lasting impacts?
I got to think though. Yes. I mean, just the idea of getting to that burnout phase. I mean, I mean, you're just putting so many different areas like that stress. I mean, our body wears that stress. Like we kind of internalize that stress. So
Hmm.
like when we say burnt out, like it's kind of like that phrase. I mean, that's just like mental fatigue. It could be physical fatigue, and that absolutely. I mean, that can affect your enthusiasm. That can affect your relationships. You know, your
Sure.
social relationships, your love life, your sex life, like you know, your physical activity levels. So I mean, and you know, when all that happens, I mean, then all of a sudden you might have like mental health challenges potentially. You know, like so I do
What do you
think
think
like
would what kind of mental health challenges do you think would manifest from that type of stressor or from burnout?
well, I think burnout can absolutely lead to a sense of, I mean, when I think of dissatisfaction, maybe a sense of like hopelessness or discouragement. I mean, it could be, I don't want to say like a major depressive episode. There's something, it was in the DSM called dysthymia, but now it's considered persistent depressive disorder. It's kind of like a more low grade depression. It's kind of like a, you know, meh, like, you know, you're not really like, there's just no enthusiasm or
Right.
optimism in you.
Like just like a
So
general feeling of like malaise over
yeah,
everything.
yeah, and I think, but you know, I mean, just think if you're like burnt out with your schedule, your job, your relationship, whatever is in your life that's causing that level of stress. I mean, clearly, like if you're getting to that point of feeling that way, it's just not sustainable for you from a physical standpoint. I mean, people have so many physical symptoms like high blood pressure and other things like that. Sometimes come from unchecked mental health things for a long period of time.
Really? How often do you see something like that happen where someone comes in, they've got, high blood pressure or something of the like, that you end up finding out is due to just simply not necessarily them being, unfit or their diet or something like that, but them carrying, some sort of stressor with them, um, for an extended period of time.
I would say I see it a lot from like my referral sources because you know I coordinate or I collaborate with like quite a few primary care physicians, and you know a lot of times even with anxiety, especially like I mean people will go to their medical doctor first, which I recommend anyway. It's good practice. You know, if you're feeling something, go to your medical doctor. You know, get a workup, get blood work. It's always good to get that checked out because you never
Sure.
know certain things might have a medical basis, but often it's not. You know, maybe all the the blood work, all that information comes back okay, or maybe there is like elevated heart rate and whatnot, and they'll make that referral because again, I think some people don't often recognize that what they're physically feeling could be related to emotions and their thought processes.
How so here that's an interesting thing. I've heard about scenarios where, people will be stressed, or, they'll have a mental, uh, how do I put it? Their mental state will manifest on their body, like someone who's super stressed breaks out in hives or something like that. Do you have any idea what causes something like that?
Um, See, it could vary because so much of though what the human brain is capable of doing. See, like I think with hives in particular, like a rash, things like that. Like I don't know what's psychosomatic. What can our brain really do? Can it really produce that? I almost think that in many ways you got to listen to those sort of symptoms. It's almost like to me like how I see it, like whether it's again anxiety through like your blood pressure or you know
Mm-hmm.
maybe other like physical feelings like I almost feel like that's a signal like your body in a way is trying to show you just tell you like it needs help, you know,
Yeah.
like I mean I treat these like signals like that's
Yeah.
why it's like I don't overlook those things because especially over time, I mean yeah there's isolated events for everybody but like if you're noticing something it means like something you're in disequilibrium of some sort. So like you got to listen to it and you have to respond in some way. So get it treated some way or another.
How do you treat something like that? Like when you see, like, let's say someone came in and they developed a rash that you were able to determine came from, extreme anxiety or extreme stress or depression or something like that. How do you treat something like that? Or do you just treat the depression or anxiety or something like that directly, and everything else follows suit behind it?
Yeah, well, you know, like anxiety, like nausea is a very common thing. Like I've had people who have had like literally like debilitating stomach cramps and aches based on like anxious situations. Um,
Is there a reason that sorry, I apologize for cutting you off, but
Oh, no
is
worries.
there a reason that anxiety, because I've heard that a lot too, is there a reason that anxiety causes things like stomach cramps in particular, or nausea? Um, like why is it that you hear people say, "Oh, I've got a pit in the bottom of my stomach" or something like that? Um, what about anxiety causes that reaction with your stomach?
Um, it's related to like adrenaline and the fight or flight response. In many respects, it's like, again, we're biologically engineered to respond to danger, whether it's real or imagined, and
Hmm.
adrenaline does that. We hear about the fight, flight, or freeze response. So in
Right.
many respects, like when our heart is beating very quickly because we're anticipating danger, blood is moving into different parts. Usually the blood kind of rushes to our extremities because, we're ready to run, we're ready to fight. Like literally, I mean, this goes back to like our evolution. Like this is just what the human body does. So a lot of times when we feel that level of anxiety and the adrenaline pumps in that way,
Right.
um, it could create like almost like, because again, stomach, like for instance, we don't need digestion is not the most important bodily function if there's danger. Like
Right.
certain functions in even our human body are kind of like delayed, sacrificed, because our bodies are literally in a mode where it's like survival is number one. Don't worry about digesting food. So sometimes just the act of like how the blood is distributing in your body creates sensations of like butterflies or nausea, stomach unrest. But it stems from that sense of adrenaline. It's really, it's again, it's your body is doing it, it's focused on something that it's preparing you to do without you even maybe being conscious of it. But what you tend to notice are maybe the things like the rapid heart rate, the sweating, the shortness of breath, which, I mean, these are things in a way
What is
that
shortness of breath? Um, what about shortness of breath is meant to, like you mentioned, digesting food in a fight or flight situation isn't necessarily priority. You would think that you would want more oxygen if you're in a fight or flight. Why do we get short of breath, or why do you think we get short of breath?
well, that one too, it's like as far as like our like just our lung capacity, I just think it kind of changes to be as efficient as possible. So like,
Okay.
believe it or not, the like hyperventilation, that's more, I think we are doing the shallow breathing ourselves because like we're feeling the sensation of almost like not suffocating, but like the air is not coming in. But we
Hmm.
really could breathe more deeply. But even
Sure.
something like that, I think it's purely because in that moment you're still getting oxygen. Our bodies won't like just let you suddenly stop again unless there's like something medically going on. Our bodies, even when you're feeling that shortness of breath, you're not going to just stop breathing. Like
Right.
at a cellular level, our bodies are trying to keep us alive at all times. Like that's just what our
Right.
cells do. So in that way, that even that, like having very kind of shorter breaths. I mean, the whole idea is like that's supposed to kind of again promote. I mean, just like anything, like a physical activity, like you're breathing kind of like faster because the heart is also pumping faster, and everything is just kind of
Okay.
moving in a just a kind of a faster mode. Because the whole idea is like get the hell out of the situation or fight the threat. You
Right.
know, um, but that again, it's like it's just kind of a body's alerting signal, and it's just moving at a much faster pace. So breathing too feels faster.
Okay. So you may be in a situation where you feel like you're hyperventilating, but someone from a an outside perspective may think that it's totally normal, but because you're hyper vigilant to what's going on, you feel like it's you know hyperactive.
Absolutely. So much of it is because it's happening at in a situation where you don't expect it to. Because like if I ran 5 miles and I was at the finish line breathing like struggling to breathe and I was sweating and my heart was racing, yeah, it's kind of uncomfortable. Nobody loves that feeling of exhaustion, but you also know like what your body's doing. You
Right.
feel like because it's doing what you expect it to do. But now,
Sure.
if I was feeling a level of sweating and heart racing because I was about to speak in front of like my classmates, that's a little bit more upsetting because you're like, what the hell's happening? Like, this is not appropriate, or this feels weird, or then embarrassment sets in. So then there's all sorts of like these feelings about your physical symptoms that can just exacerbate the anxiety, you know?
Right.
It's almost
Yeah,
like we,
absolutely.
yeah.
Sorry.
Well, we can conspire against this because, like, in many ways, our body does things. Like even that, like if I mean, a common one is like sweating inappropriately. I mean, again, if you're playing a basketball game with your friends and you're sweating, you don't necessarily think about it. So it's not like you're going to create more of like that symptom, that physical symptom. But
Sure.
again, if you're noticing you're sweating because you're like on a date, all of a sudden you're noticing it. The adrenaline, that fear is kind of pumping. It's creating more sweat, which you're noticing more of. You're feeling more embarrassed. So again, it just exacerbates things.
So let me ask you this. Why is it that a lot of people will say, like, you mentioned like you're about to give a speech in front of classmates and something like that. Why is it that right before you get super anxious and you start to feel all those feelings, but for a lot of people, the instant that they start doing it, that all kind of fades away?
You know what? I think in many ways it's anticipation versus the actual like action of something. Because I do think like once our bodies kind of are performing, it could also be less thinking that is involved in certain respects. Like, not to say that you don't think when you're public speaking, but you have a more singular focus. I do think the nature of anxiety, it's almost like you hear it all the time, like, over analyzing, overthinking, over worrying. But so much of it too, it's like, whether you're anticipating and over or stressing about a sporting event coming up, when you're
Mm-hmm.
actually performing it, you're almost like it's a more singular kind of, you almost like narrow your mind and focus to, again, just it almost like reduces stress because you're just in that moment doing what you should be doing.
So do you think that that's more like the adrenaline is now actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, where like with fight or flight, how in that situation now you've almost made a conscious decision to fight in a way, and it's shutting out the rest of the world in a way, so that you're just so focused on what you're doing, that you forget about the rapid heartbeat, the everything else that's going along with it. Like I think about, as an example, I think about when I played in a tournament at a convention. Uh, right before every match started, I could literally feel my heart pounding, and then the match would start, and then all of a sudden I noticed I didn't even hear the crowd that was gathering around the like stage that we were playing around. Um, and prior to that, I was very aware of everything that was going on around me, to the point where I was like, "Oh shit, I'm totally gonna blow this because I'm not going to be able to focus on what I'm doing, and I'm going to totally screw up all my decision making, and it's going to be absolute. It's going to be a disaster." Do you think that it's almost as if the adrenaline and the fight or flight response is doing its job at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're like harnessing it because like fight or flight, I mean, fight is like kind of approaching something and flight is avoiding something. So also like by virtue of approaching something with that adrenaline, whether it's a sporting event, a tournament, a speech, like that's to me like effective harnessing of that adrenaline. And I mean, keep in mind too, it also minimizes the worry because I try to use analogies like if there's like a bear that's literally in my house and I notice it and I have to either run or fight, I'm not necessarily thinking about, what my neighbors are going to think if they see me running, or I'm not thinking about what I'm having for dinner tomorrow or my deadline. Like, it reduces a lot of those outside things that our brain just naturally gravitates towards. Because, I mean, our brain's a thinking, worrying machine. Again, like
Mm-hmm.
from an evolutionary standpoint, this is the one thing, like, people hate worry, but you can't rid your mind of that. Like, it's been evolutionarily designed to worry to keep you alive. Like,
Sure.
even if you think everything in your life is okay, your mind will find something that might not be okay because it's trying to, again, get you more of something, less of something. It's trying to keep you like satiated. But I guess like again, like when there's a threat like that, it just you just put the blinders on a lot of things. All of a sudden you're not hearing the crowd if it's like a sporting event, you're not thinking about, embarrassing yourself necessarily. You're just trying to perform. You've harnessed effectively that adrenaline into the task.
What do you think, people you can? Do you have any pointers that you could give anybody for helping them to actually harness that kind of energy? So, like, if they're nervous about a job interview, I think is a very real thing that a lot of people are either going through right now or going to be going through in the very near future, and that's a pretty anxiety-inducing situation. You're essentially going into a scenario where um, you've got to sell yourself, uh, and it could change your whole economic situation. And what are some things that you think people should know or focus on to make sure that they get the most out of that response and they're able to harness it effectively?
So yes, you're gonna feel like that anticipation, and it's gonna. So there's things that you could do before the moment. I think in general it goes back to preparation because you want to feel a level of you want to feel reassured going into anything. Ideally speaking, even
Hmm.
if like you totally prepare incorrectly, at least going into it, it's like that perception. Like you want to feel confident going in. Ideally speaking, and at least doing something, having a routine or just something that you can do to feel reassured. That's why people might look at the website of whatever company they're applying to. You do a little research. You're like, all
Hmm.
right, I got some things, or you practice right with people, or maybe you look up some common interview questions. Like, I mean, these are just little things that people do without knowing. They're trying to again reduce maybe that unwanted adrenaline response. They're also
Hmm.
trying to you're trying to like harness some of that into something productive. Now, in the moment, though, so much of it, it's like it's kind of what we choose to focus on. And attention is like a muscle. So attention, awareness, and focus, it's kind of like a muscle. And a lot of times where our attention, focus, and awareness goes, it goes to a lot of unrelated shit or problems. Sorry. Like it goes,
It doesn't bother you. Can say whatever you want.
oh, okay. Yeah, no, but like our attention, we might be paying attention to the thought of like how important this job is. And if we screw up this interview, we're going to, fail at like, we're just going to fail and we're going to be wastes of life. So our attention, if it goes to the worry, it could create more. So it's how can you bring your attention to that moment that you're in? And if you're in an interview, it might seem basic, but are you really in the interview room with the person? Are you listening? Are you really trying to understand what that person's saying? Or are you so caught up in paying attention to your heart, paying attention to how you sound, how you look? Are you paying attention to like, oh my God, this is scary? Attention drifts in many different ways, but if we learn to like really bring our attention to that moment that we're in, it just reduces a lot of anxiety. And you might notice it in different times in your life, like whether it's through sports or a hobby, yoga, like even studying, for instance. Like we call it almost like when you get in the zone, when you're in flow. There've been books about this, like how to get in flow and how to be in the zone, because that's really when we feel our
So what
best.
what
Yeah.
I'm familiar with what flow, what you're referring to. Like, can you define what that actually is, so that if anybody that isn't familiar with it or hasn't done any kind of research on it, what flow actually is? It sounds like flow, whatever. But
Yeah, I
like,
might be
what
butchering the
is it
definition.
actually?
I might be butchering the definition, but for me, it's always meant like when our mind and body is kind of like in sync, and we're
Hmm.
pretty much not mindful like meditation, but we are in the here and now in a very real way. Where again, our mind and body are in sync in performing something, doing something. We're fully engaged in what we're doing in that moment. People tend to notice like when they're in flow because like time flies seemingly, or like
Hmm.
you look up at the clock, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I was just doing that for 3 hours. Like, but that truly means like your awareness and focus was truly in that moment of whatever you were doing, whether it was golfing with your buddies, whether it was needlework, like whether it was
Right.
carpentry, whether
Yeah.
it was
Like,
like writing a paper.
yeah. It was always the definition that is far less eloquent than the way that you put it was when you feel when you get up from an activity and you're like, oh, I was in the zone,
Yeah.
um, and time flew by and all, you were just so hyper focused. But how do you? What are some things that you can like? Obviously, I don't expect you to define or like really explain to someone how to get into that state, but what are some things that help you to maintain your focus? You said with the interview, um, are you really in the room with the person interviewing you? How do you stay in the room, and how do you not focus on your heart rate or your breathing or your sweating? For so many people, how do you do that?
Well, you have to almost, again, it goes back to like attention, and you have to purposefully put your attention somewhere. Now, I know that seems impossible. Like if your heart is beating very fast, you're going to notice your attention is going to go to it and be like, what's happening? But
Hmm.
like there has to be also an acknowledgement. You see, like you can notice when your attention is going to places, accept what is happening, and then bring that attention, purposely speaking, bring it back to where it needs to go. And that's almost like what we call that. It's like it's there's a school of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, and much of it has to do with how our attention has to be brought to places. We have to like unhook from our worry and bring our attention to something like that we're doing, like an action. So if I was in an interview and all of a sudden I'm going in with all this fear and worry, and I'm noticing my body's doing things, I am going to bring my attention on really trying to understand and listen to every word that the person is saying, and really trying to comprehend those questions. Not think about what I'm going to say, not think about like what I like, not trying to answer my own questions in my head ahead of time. Because now your attention is not on the person. Your attention is on what you're anticipating the person's going to ask. You see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
it's really bringing your attention to what you're doing in that moment, whether that's listening, speaking, doing whatever you're doing. And it's hard because constantly we're always thinking. It's just sometimes we're not noticing those thoughts. So you got to bring that attention back to what you're doing. And people do silly things. Like some people might imagine, like I've heard people like they literally imagine like dropping an anchor, and it's like they visualize it, like, oh, I'm thinking again about all this stuff, like, or you picture a stop sign, or you have to almost like jumpstart you have to do something consciously to almost like let yourself know, like, all right, I'm doing that thing where I'm drifting, get back in the moment. In a job interview, it's harder because it's like one-on-one. You can't really like do something elaborate, but you have to like, you'll notice when your attention is. So maybe just like a physical thing, or touch something, with your pen, write something down. One thing that I've done grounding wise is it helps me from drifting. Like I bring a notepad and I will write down what someone is saying, or maybe what I'm thinking. So at least it's like out of my head for a minute, and I can now focus on what's happening.
Mm-hmm. So you then go back to that, like let's say you have a thought and you write it down, and then you're focused on what they're saying. Is that so that you can then refer back to your notes, and so that you don't necessarily have to remember
Yes.
what you were thinking in that moment, and it can kind of like jog your memory and be like, okay, I can focus on this person now, and know that in the back there's almost like a third party kind of keeping tabs for me so that I can come back to my thoughts.
Yeah, like I'm no longer worrying about what I just wanted to say. Like if I had this
Right.
thought and I didn't say it because I didn't have an opportunity to, you might start ruminating and thinking like, okay, can I say it now? Can I, like now all of a sudden again you're not thinking or listening to what the lecturer is saying, or like you're thinking about when you could speak. So yeah, I think like with notes or just writing something down, and again it kind of like frees up that worry. It's like, all right, it's down there, don't have to think about it again. Now I can go back. Like there's
Right.
just little strategies like that. Like how can you get back into the present moment, the here and now, and less in your own mind with all those like worries and the fears and insecurities and anxieties, because it gets tiring for anyone.
Yeah. How do you feel about meditation?
I mean, meditation is designed for that. I mean, so many Buddhist principles, or not even just Buddhism, but like so much of it is that, like yoga, meditation. It essentially is that. It's almost like noticing your thoughts, letting your thoughts be what they are, but then kind of connecting to what your body, your physical sensations, your breathing, your posture. I mean, meditation truly, it's like working out that aspect, your awareness and your ability to be present. Just like going to the gym, like I do feel like meditation is, people overlook it, but it is it really can do amazing things. It's just hard because again, like from a cultural standpoint, like we know working out benefits your body, you see your muscles or you see your weight changing, but like
Mm-hmm.
meditation, it's not as like practiced here, and you don't see the results as vividly. So it's just sometimes people like overlook it.
Do you, uh, maybe a little bit of a personal question, do you find yourself meditating ever?
Not as much as I should, but I've done yoga. I mean, pre pandemic, obviously, like, but
Well,
yoga
yeah.
has been very helpful for me because that really helps me stay and again like quiet my mind.
So I got to ask, because I've been pre-pandemic, I was considering taking a yoga class just to see what it's all about. Um, what do you find you get out of yoga? Because I've never done it. I have nothing to judge it on. I have no, I have very uh, mainstream, I guess you could say, expectations for what it is. So I don't know that they're accurate. Um, what's that? What's yoga actually like? Because you've been through it and done it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a workout. I mean, like I prefer
Yeah.
weightlifting, but I find yoga, I mean, is a perfect complement because it helps with flexibility and like
Mm-hmm.
muscle relaxing and things like that. I mean, besides just being a workout, I mean, you are burning calories and you are improving flexibility, which has been shown to help, like also just how you physically feel.
Sure.
Um, a lot of it has to do with like how you manage your breathing while putting your body in these really hard positions. So like in a way, you want to talk about like managing anxiety. When I'm in a stretching, when I'm in an uncomfortable stretch that's unfamiliar to me, my heart is racing. I might even be panicking a little bit. I'm feeling wobbly. I'm like, I'm struggling. Now I'm feeling anxious. My heart might be racing. But yoga almost helps you learn to connect to your breathing in a way where it's almost like, despite what you're physically experiencing, you're able to relax in that moment. So I do feel like it just helps because it really focuses in on a breathing and kind of present moment mindset, as
Mhm.
well as just like the physical exertion piece.
Do you think that yoga can actually help with things like anxiety?
Yeah, because I mean, I just think like in anything, like I mean, if you can quiet your mind during yoga and connect to your like, who's to say why can't you quiet your mind again before an interview, or like before you have to public speak, or before a tournament? I mean, so much of it is like, again, it's really just about quieting the mind. Because the thing is, like, our worries are always going to be there. So you're not like going to run away from your worries. You're not going to ever you might get rid of a certain stress, but guess what? You're going to worry about another one or new one. It's just like, you're not going to escape worry. So you
Yeah.
have to learn how to respond to worry a little bit differently.
No, that's a good point. I definitely. There's so many things that with the pandemic that I've kind of like uh, I miss. Um, most of all is the gym because of that. Like, I miss being able to kind of have that release, and I'm kind of bummed that I never actually got to try the yoga class. And I'm looking forward to when New Jersey starts to open things back up. Oh, Jordan's in the chat. What's going on, dude? Um, you know, primarily because I feel like the more I was able to work out, the more I was able to focus on things like that, the more I was able to actually quiet my mind in other situations and be able to do that. Um, you know, how much do you feel like people's physical fitness actually plays into their ability to maintain their mental fitness?
Like what we're talking about too, like I mean, so much of again, our mental health can contribute, like can show up in our physical symptoms. So taking care of our body just from a holistic standpoint, it is very important because I mean, both our mind and body are, like, do feed into one another. So I do also just think in general, like I mean, we know about the endorphin release. I mean, there are actually neurochemicals that are released in exercise. It's been proven. So it's like, I mean, I read this book, I forgot what it was titled, but our brain has certain chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin. Oxytocin comes from like relationships and being close to a loved one,
Right.
attachment with people. Dopamine is like, when you feel like accomplished. Serotonin, pleasurable activities. Endorphins are from exercise. Like, we can literally like hack our own brains to produce happy chemicals. So exercise is one of those. So why not do it? Like,
So how does that actually hack your brain to do that? Like I know it does, but what about uh, doing that actually kind of rewires your brain to do that? Also, Jordan, thanks for the follow.
well,
Sorry, I
okay.
had to throw that in at the end because I just saw it come up in the feed.
Now again, like I'm not going to know all the scientific mechanisms right now, like as far as how that works. Some of it is just like how we're biologically geared. I mean, maybe in
Hmm.
some respects, because we are a physical species, maybe endorphin release happens because we feel good by doing it, so we're encouraged to do it more, which is kind of, again, like a survival thing. I mean, so much again of what our body does is to survive and procreate and persist. Like, that's what we are at a cellular level, is that we are trying to survive, pass our genes on. It's part
Yeah.
of what we are. So, I mean, I do think even from that standpoint, though, like, the physicality of things and just what it does for our body, I mean, it is a release in many ways. It does kind of like release potentially kind of like that internalized stress you might be wearing. Like when we talk about burnout, it's like you have to expend energy. Like we have energy to expend. So, I mean, again, our human bodies, how we evolved, we were not meant to be sitting behind the desk for 10 hours, right? Like we were people that would travel and walk and move and hunt. And I mean, these are things in our human history from an anthropological standpoint. Like, so you have to physically do something. Like,
Right.
it's part of what we evolved to do.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we'll end on that one. I appreciate you. I really appreciate you coming out again. I like the more focused route that we were able to take this time. Um, and I'm always interested in hearing your insight on a lot of these things because it really does fascinate me a lot. And I hope it brings some value to the people listening. Um, because to me, it's a very interesting subject, and I appreciate you taking time, especially now that it's 10:30 at night. Uh, you know,
And I'm not, and forgive me, I'm not a neuropsychologist. So, I mean, there's a lot about the brain. I mean, even for those that study the brain, I mean, there's a lot of unknowns about it, obviously. Like, even in
sure,
2020, we do not know everything. So, like, I have a very basic understanding of some things. I would say for
probably
me,
better than most people, though.
but I mean, it's important to know, but like, I do focus more on like behavioral aspects,
Hmm.
relationships, interactions. So, so for instance, like, yeah, so again, like if you ever want to dialogue about those things, I feel those might be more in my like comfort zone, but I
Hmm.
hope that at least some of like the brain talk or just biology, genetic stuff, was was useful for you.
I think it was fantastic. Again, I really appreciate it. So, hopefully, we'll be able to continue the dialogue at a later date on more, you know, dig in deeper on some of these topics.
Sounds good. Thanks for
Yeah, man.
having me.
Absolutely.